Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm doing my reading wrap up for the month of October. So October was a mixture of Victober and spooky things with BlackOWeenAthon for me, and I think I read either 10 or 12 books, I can't quite remember which. Now the first book I actually want to talk about was one that I read in September that I totally forgot to mention in my wrap up for that, and that is The Age of Miracles by Karen Wallace Thompson, I believe. So this is a YA kind of post-apocalyptic fiction, and it is set in a world where the Earth's rotation is slowly slowing down, so the length of the day changes and is starting to increase and increase as we go, and kind of equally the length of the night. It's a coming of age tale which has got a teenage girl as its main protagonist because it is YA, so the focus is less on the science of exactly why this is happening and more on like her experiences, how this impacts school, and then her first kind of serious relationship. So because of that, the focus of the book is quite different to the kinds of books I tend to read in post-apocalyptic fiction. But as far as coming of age stories go, I did think it was really lovely, and I did really enjoy the kind of features of the world in terms of how that would impact the slowing down, even if exploring the science behind it wasn't really the goal of Karen Wallace Thompson. I hope I'm getting her name right. So it's definitely like, it is YA, that's its audience, but I think that it's a really enjoyable read and worth checking out if you do like post-apocalyptic style fiction. So now to talk about this month, and I'm actually going to go in reverse the way that I normally do. I'm going to talk about the books I finished most recently and work my way back through the month. So yesterday I actually finished Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. This is a fiction and it is a kind of modern classic. It's set in the 1950s in Paris and it is about a torrid love affair, and it is our main character David who falls in love with Giovanni, who he has this like love affair with as a gay romance, which was unacceptable in America but slightly more acceptable in France, I believe. And David is American, so he's kind of grappling with some of his feelings with it. He also has a slightly wayward fiance who is doing her own travels, and it's about this sort of vague love triangle that forms and how David deals with his emotions about Giovanni, who represents a lot of forbidden love in a lot of different ways. James Baldwin's writing is absolutely stunning. He is a really kind of classic author for a reason, and this is probably one of his most well known. It was the group book for the BlackOWeenAthon readathon, and I just thought that it was absolutely beautiful, and it really captured the essence of what it feels like to have very strong emotional and very immediate visceral connection with somebody who you feel like you shouldn't have that connection with, and that love is forbidden, and kind of the conflict that can create. So it was a really wonderful read. It's quite short, and I definitely want to check out more James Baldwin in the future. I especially want to check out some of his non-fiction because I think that given the power that he brought to this fiction, I think his non-fiction memoir would be really incredible. The next book I have to talk about is Everfair by Nisi Shawl. This is a historical fiction and it's kind of a speculative alternative history, and it is retelling the invasion of the Congo by King Leopold and Belgium, but as if the country of Congo had access to steampunk technology. So it sets up a premise where the land is actually bought from Leopold and is set up as a country called Everfair, which is supposed to be a sort of refuge and safe place for lots of the people in Africa who are being invaded. It's a really sprawling, impressive book that has a huge cast of characters and covers 30 years. So it's less about like really focusing on each individual character, and it's more giving this kind of epic tale. So because of that, I didn't really feel like I had a very strong emotional connection with any one of the characters in particular. But I do think it's a really, really impressive book and an impressive feat to kind of take on. And I really enjoyed huge chunks of it. There was a part in the middle that was a little bit slow, but definitely towards the end I really liked how it wrapped itself up, and I thought that it was very ambitious and well executed for what it was. Also, it's really highlighted that my knowledge of what actually happened in the Congo is seriously lacking, so it then meant that my ability to appreciate the alternative history parts of it was also a little bit lacking, and it is going to definitely prompt me to try and fill in those gaps in my knowledge a little bit more. And I really enjoyed the steampunk-esque way that the technology was like woven through this and how that impacted things. Very, very cool book in general. Totally worth checking out if you like historical fiction. The next book that I finished was White is Bewitching by Helen Oyeyemi, and this is like a literary horror. It is about a haunted house that has haunted this family for generations and has a tendency of trying to capture the women in its generation, and the main focus is on a young woman who is suffering from an eating disorder. It's a mixture of kind of anorexia and also pica, which is where you eat things that are not food, so kind of plastic and things like that, and it's about her struggle with that, but also with this house that is an actual like narrator presence in the book and is trying to sort of ensnare her. There's a little bit of a kind of epistolary novel sort of format to it, because it's actually also told from the point of view of her twin brother and her good friend slash girlfriend at points, although they don't really define it too much. And it is about, she kind of goes missing, which you know that from the very offset of the book, and it's about where they think that she's gone. It was creepy and spooky and foreboding and really playing around with a lot of experimental things, which normally isn't what I go for in fiction, but I found this so compelling and so like skin crawling and spine tingling, and I just deeply enjoyed it to a degree that I really wasn't expecting. I've had a mixed bag with Helen Oyeyemi before, but this one was a really incredible read and probably is one of the most surprisingly enjoyable reads of this entire year for me. So if you're in the mood for some spooky stuff, you should definitely check this out. I actually recommended this recently in a video about horror books, which I'll link down below. So I had actually intended to read Wildseed by Octavia Butler in the month of October, which is part of the Octavia E. Butler slow read along, but I had some real issues getting a hold of a copy, so instead I decided to jump in with her book Dawn, which I happen to have on audiobook anyway. This one is about a woman who wakes up and she has been kind of in her eyes kidnapped by an alien race, and it turns out that humanity has been all but wiped out and she is sort of one of the last surviving ones, and they're determined to help her sort of reintroduce and repopulate Earth after all of this chaos has happened, and it's about her interactions with this alien race who's trying to save humanity. It's the kind of book that I really deeply enjoyed it to a degree that I was not actually expecting. I went into it not really knowing much about the plot. I loved the world building, I loved the sci-fi elements, I loved the alien race and how they kind of did things and sort of the way that their society worked. And I also really enjoy the discussion of like, what are humans, what are our major flaws, what are our kind of major weaknesses and strengths, and what sort of is the purpose to us. It really reminded me of Becky Chambers's Wayfarer series, the Wayfarer series, specifically book 3, which has a lot of stuff to do with like what are humans like as a species compared to sort of from like an outsider's perspective, and I really enjoyed that. I definitely want to continue on with the trilogy. It's quite short, all the audiobooks are kind of 10 hours or less, so my intention is to try and finish it off by the end of the year, and I'm going to do that instead of following along with the read along, because actually Wildseed, which I was supposed to be reading, is book 1 of a 4-parter, so it makes more sense to finish the trilogy that I've started and then jump in with that one a little bit later on, potentially next year. The next book I finished, and probably the not the only non-fiction, there is one more non-fiction that I read this month, but anyway, it's Witches by Tracy Borman. So this is a historical non-fiction that is looking at specifically James I and the English witch hunts in a very specific time period, and what it's doing is it's focusing on a specific case, which was the Flowers family at the Belvoir Manor House, I believe, if I'm remembering all those details correctly, and it is using that as a jumping off point to explore what was happening in Britain at the time and what was going on with these witch hunts and why were they occurring. Witch hunts is something which has happened across the world in so many different places, and also kind of sparked up multiple different times, so it's quite easy for people to make a lot of kind of sweeping throwaway comments about why witch hunts were a big thing, and I definitely know there's a lot of feminist rhetoric online about them being like a specific attack against women, whereas I actually think that this book does a really good and interesting job exploring all the different nuances of like why the various different instances of like witch hunting mania appeared as a moral panic, and kind of discusses the different ways that this same moral panic can manifest in different countries and different regions based on what was important and going on at the time. The argument in this book that is a lot of James I's sort of obsession with the witch hunts was linked to the kind of conflict between Catholics and Protestants at the time, and also the tendency for there to be so much ritual and pomp within Catholicism, which was not dissimilar to a lot of the stuff that was happening from kind of medicine women in local villages, and just general discussions of exploitation of power in general, which was really interesting. I would definitely recommend this book. I think it has that perfect balance in history between like big macro looking at sort of major events that are happening, but then also really like zooming down on this one particular example and using it to illustrate macro themes that were being discussed. I definitely want to check out more from Tracy Borman in the future. This was excellent. The next book that I finished was Two on a Tower by Thomas Hardy. This was part of the Stitch and Listen read along that was happening for Victober, so I listened to this on audiobook whilst also doing a little bit of embroidery, and if you'd like to see what I made, it's just up here. I did this, which I think is very cute. I'm very pleased with it. Anyway, back to the book. So Two on a Tower is kind of a star-crossed lovers idea, and it is about a woman whose husband is away, and then she ends up patronizing patroning, is that the word? Sponsoring a young gentleman who is really interested in astronomy and is using some of her land to try and make some of these scientific explorations, and it's about their romance as it forms. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil the ending, but I thought that the ending was absolutely hilarious and absurd, and it is the classic over-the-top ridiculousness that I would expect from a classic of that era. I think that it was really wonderful. This was my first Thomas Hardy, and I really enjoyed his writing. I liked the kind of blend of sort of the social demands and requirements of the characters, and then also this kind of very objective calculating science side of things. And I really loved the discussions of when the main character, who was into the science and astronomy, talked about his love and explained why he was so into it. A lot of that really resonated with my own interest just in the world in general and non-fiction. So as far as reading experiences go, I thought it was interesting. Oh god, sorry about that, I just had to save my charger from my rabbit. So yeah, I thought that the ending was really entertaining, but generally I liked the Hardy, and I'm definitely going to try another Hardy in the future. The next book that I finished is The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. I listened to this on audiobook as well, and this is one of the very earliest detective novels, according to the back anyway. And this is about a missing diamond and a whole conspiracy wrapped up within it. It's a bit of a chunker of a book, but I generally enjoyed more of it than I didn't. It's because it's the time period where a lot of the sort of novel writing, you had to have like an artifice for why you were writing the novel. So there had to be some kind of like, this person is telling this other human being, like you couldn't just have a generic narrator. So a lot of it is done in sort of epistolary form. It's a detective pulling together all these different accounts, which meant that the narrators definitely changed from kind of chapter to chapter, and I enjoyed some of them far more than others. The earlier character of the butler I found really entertaining, but there was a middle character who was a woman who was very religious and annoying with it, and her section was definitely a little unbearable. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that this book is a little bit racist in places towards people who are of Indian descent or Hinduism potentially. I think it was Hinduism. And yeah, it was kind of doing a little bit of a Temple of Doom kind of vibe to it in places, but that isn't the majority of the book, so it's up to you how whether you want to not read it because of that or not. Generally, I think Wilkie Collins was pretty good, and I would be inclined to pick up The Woman in White, which is his kind of other big one as well, at some point soon. And I thought that this was enjoyable, but as like with pretty much all classics, you just have to accept there's going to be sections of it where you're a little bit bored, and that rang true for this one, as it does with pretty much all of my classics reading experiences. The next book that I finished was The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski. This is the book one in the kind of Witcher series, and it's actually a collection of short stories about Geralt, who is the Witcher, and it does map very closely to the TV show, whereas the TV show includes a little bit more information. As a rule of thumb, I found it pretty enjoyable. I like some of the twists of the classic fairy tales that are happening in the book, and as a rule of thumb, I kind of enjoyed the overarching plot that was happening there, and I definitely will continue with the series at some point in the future, but I'm not immediately running out to go and grab it, if that makes sense. It's the kind of book that was enjoyable, but it's definitely not anything special to write home about, and I think something that the book kind of suffered slightly in comparison with is the fact that I have seen the Witcher series, so some of the fun twists I'd kind of already seen. One thing that was nice was there are a few episodes of The Witcher, the TV show, where I was like, I do not get what is happening, and I think that that was a common experience from the fans who had not engaged with any of the Witcher world or verse beforehand. So the book was really helpful at explaining what was happening with a few of them, especially with, I think it's Renfrey is one of the characters. It's an early story that I really appreciated and I think was done much better. So I'm going to definitely continue it at some point. The next book that I finished is Half-Blood Blues by Edugyan. This is a historical fiction set in 1940 in Paris, and it is about a gentleman who gets dragged away by what will eventually become the Nazi regime, and then it's also about some of the characters involved with that much later trying to find out about his story and to try and explain what happened and potentially even track him down. This book is also about jazz, because everybody involved who are major players are jazz musicians, and it's about the jazz kind of world in general around that time, what was happening both in America and in Paris, and just generally like the importance of music. It's the kind of book that was really beautiful, and I deeply enjoyed my reading experience of it, and I definitely want to check out more from the author in the future. I just like, you know, you just have historical fiction where it just kind of feels cozy and comfy and right and just really perfect for the winter season, and it just felt really warm as a reading experience, and I deeply enjoyed it. I loved all the characters, and I loved the discussion about what does it mean to have your story and be able to tell your own story and what are people's stories in their life. And the final book that I read, or rather the first book that I read in the month of October that I finished, was The Covent Garden Ladies by Hallie Rubenhold. This is a non-fiction that was specifically looking at something called the Harris List, which was a kind of compendium, encyclopedia, directory of various women who worked in kind of the profession of prostitution in, I believe it was either the 15 or 1600s. I can't remember. Anyway, sorry, I read it at the beginning of the month and I don't have my copy to hand to flick through it. So it's about the people who were involved directly within that, and then conversations about sex work in general within that time period and how one could end up in that position, the kind of how common it was in some ways, and just generally conversations about sex work in general in history, which I really enjoyed. Hallie Rubenhold is the author of The Five, which is a very, very big book on BookTube and just sort of in the non-fiction world, which is about the 5 women that Jack the Ripper killed and trying to give a voice back to them. And I feel like, so this book was written just before The Five. It's kind of her previous book to that. And I feel like you can really see the threads of what will then become The Five later, but was just not quite as tight, not quite as interesting, not quite as kind of well fleshed out in this particular book. So if you're a fan of The Five, I think this is definitely worth a read, especially if you like history in general, but I don't think it quite has that magic favourite, definitely going to be recommending it over and over again, that something like The Five had. Also, there was a section in it where there was huge chunks of the Harris List that I found incredibly boring, so I skipped those bits. So that is it for what I have read in the month of October. I want to apologise, I've kept like looking down, my rabbit's running around and she's kind of in a semi-destructive mood, so I've had to run off and save a couple of different things that she's suddenly decided that she wants to eat. So that's why I'm not actually looking at the camera for sections of this, so I apologise for very poor video editing form there. So that's pretty much it from me for today. What do you think? Have you read any of these? Just, you know what to do in the comments down below. Have a wonderful reading week and I'll chat to you soon. Bye.